So the annual report should be submitted through the annual report portal by 5 p.m. on Friday, March 5th. For those of you who have done this before, you'll notice that this year we have an extra 2 weeks to submit the report to STLS for review, which is pretty exciting. Before submitting, you should complete all sections and questions, including the suggested improvement section, which is all the way at the bottom of the sections on the left-hand side where you navigate through the report. That section is required. You must complete it. You should also review all of your edit checks and save your report before you submit. To complete the annual report, we ask that you please use the annual report portal, which is called Collect Connect. The link to access the portal is on the screen, and an STLS consultant who's on the call might be able to drop that into the chat for you now, and if not, I'll do that after I'm done talking. The portal is accessible via all major internet browsers and on both Apple and PC computers, so you can access it from the devices that you have, no problem. Please note only one user from your library should be logged into your report at one time to avoid loss of data. So perhaps the director is working on the report and the treasurer has some sections to complete. Please only have one person logged into the report at a time. If you file for multiple libraries, we would ask that you please only log into one library report at a time. Okay. So let's talk about the data provided by STLS. We do a lot of the work for you. We'll pull your circulation statistics and other data. All of those numbers can be found on the STLS website, again, via the link on the screen, which connects to the annual report webpage on the annual report or on the STLS website. Again, a consultant has perhaps dropped the link in the chat, and if not, I will do that as soon as I'm done talking. So this is a screenshot of what the web page looks like. And then as we move to the next slide, this is a breakdown of a more in-depth look at what the site looks like. It's a bit different this year. I've created a section for each section of the annual report. So you can see at the top of the page, section 1, general library info. That is also section 1 of the annual report. Section 2, library collection, same as section 2 of the annual report. If you click the little plus button to the right-hand side of each section, it will open up that grouping, and then you'll see tabs with instructions and helpful tips, and in some cases, data provided by STLS, which you can see in the second section on the screen if you're joining us with a computer, where we provide the holdings data for questions 2.1 to 2.24, and then additions data for questions 2.26 to 2.29. When you click on those tabs, the word here is a hyperlink, and it will open the spreadsheet with the data you're used to seeing from STLS.
All right, so this is just a quick reminder of what the annual report is asking for as far as resident and non-resident borrowers go. Resident borrowers are those that reside within the library's chartered service area, and then non-resident borrowers are kind of everybody else that's registered to your library but aren't within your service area. Oops. And then here is, let me make sure my slides catch up. All right, great. Here is just a slide from workflows of exactly where that information is coming from. So it's right here in the, I'm in modify user to show it, but it's under the demographics tab. And here it's labeled as city, but we also refer to it sometimes as user category 1. But it's this field right here, which should match the user's address. And because I live in Pennsylvania, we don't have Pennsylvania cities listed. We're all just kind of lumped together because we don't really count when it comes to service areas in New York State. And now I'm just going to go over real quick to, let's see, the annual report itself. And I never have the link on me, so I always just do a quick search here for it. And this is the page that Erica was just pointing out before. So the registered borrowers information is going to be down here under section 3. And if I expand that and then go to registered borrowers, and then we can look at the spreadsheet itself. Now, everything I'm going to cover this morning is kind of broken down here in notes 1 and 2, but I just wanted to kind of explain it and give you guys a visual example too, just because it's a little bit complicated. All right, so the first tab is just kind of the bare bones data as far as resident versus non-resident borrowers. tab number 2 actually breaks it down really clearly as far as which library, which is going to be the columns over here, and then which user category 1 or city that we just looked at in workflows. So for example, for Addison, we take their total number of borrowers, and we subtract everybody, or we consider everybody that has Addison as a city/user category 1 as a resident, and then all other patrons as non-residents. So that's just the bare bones calculation that we provide for you. There are some libraries that have more complicated charter to serve service areas. So we want to make sure that you have all this raw data so you can do the calculations yourself if necessary. And we always provide the second tab every year and try to explain it to you guys, but this year it's even a little bit more complicated than in previous years. And we have a third tab to kind of help us with the complication from this year, which is that online users, they don't have this user category form or field in their form when they're registering online. So all of those, let me scroll down here. All of those are counted up down at the bottom as undefined. And then what we did with this third tab is we broke down those undefined numbers by the city or state, which the patron, or either the patron or a staff member input. So we've always had instances where patrons haven't had this information in their record, even when staff are registering them, but we just have even more this year because of the online user registrations. And so here you can just see the freehand text that either patrons or staff have put in the user record and the address field are shown here. So let me get back to here and show you an actual example of the adding and subtracting that we did for one library. So if you're Addison and your service area is Addison, then you don't have to do any further calculation. You can just take the numbers that we give you. But Hammondsport is an example where their Hammondsport numbers are 624. So that's how many people it looks like are resident borrowers, but we know from their charter to serve service area that Hammondsport Village, which is a separate item category, or I'm sorry, user category, and also Urbana are part of Hammondsport's charter to serve service area. So what we do down here, oops, sorry guys. What we do down here is we add that 784 and the 1100 to the 624 to get the 2,508. And then we want to make sure that we subtract those same numbers from the non-resident. So that total should never change. That all amount up top right here should never change. So if we're adding something to resident, we have to subtract it from non-resident. And this is all from tab 2 that I'm taking the information from. And then, so we get these new totals of 2,500 versus 1,500, which are more accurate for Hammondsport. If we want to be really precise, we can go to that third tab, and we find that 3 of Hammondsport's patrons that have an undefined user category actually have a Hammondsport, New York address in their user record. So here you can see we added 3 to that number that we calculated before. We subtracted 3 from non-resident, and then we have our final totals for resident and non-resident. And then just as a fun data check, I always like to add those 2 numbers again and just make sure that they match up with the total number over here. And they did, so we know that we did our math right. All right, any questions before I hand it back over to Erica? Oh, one more slide to show you. So this is just kind of a review of everything that we just talked about. Just take a look at tabs 2 and 3 to be really accurate. The final total shouldn't change. So if you're adding something to resident, you want to make sure you're subtracting it from non-resident. And if you have any questions about your service area, or you just want a second brain to review your numbers, just ask us and we can help you with that.
Thank you, Mandy. I really appreciate that. And as Mandy said, she'll be on the call. So when we get to the Q&A section, if you have questions about registered borrowers, I know that was a lot of information, you can certainly ask. Move us forward through all these resident borrower slides. All right. So as you work to complete the annual report, try to think of it as if you're telling a story of what happened to your library in 2020. If there was a significant change in funding or circulation, why did that happen? And then after you understand why, include a note, an explanation in the notes field to explain that. We do know that COVID-19 was an issue for all libraries in 2020. So while it may be tempting to list COVID-19 as a reason for why lots of your answers are different this year, please do not include COVID-19 under question 1.49, which asks about unusual circumstances. The state knows that all of us experienced COVID this year, and then that will cause fluctuations in numbers. They've also disabled some edit checks throughout the report because of those fluctuations that they anticipate. Speaking of adding notes, for situations where you do need to include a note, we please use the note feature in the report. You can see it here in this screenshot on the screen. It occurs next to a question. There's a flag option where you could flag a question and save it for later. And then there's a note button. When you click on note, it will open a field below the question where you can insert text about that particular question and make sure you hit save for the note, and then it will save that information with that question in the report. So for example, if you did a major weeding project in 2020, you might include a note about it in section 2, which would ask about your library collection. When you are logged into the annual report portal, you'll see an option in the upper right corner to show last year's answers. I would recommend that you all enable this feature. It's helpful when you're trying to make comparisons or see differences and changes from 2019 to 2020 in the data that you're entering, and it should help you see when there are significant increases or decreases in numbers that would require an explanation and a note. It's also helpful if you're working on the report for the first time to see what someone put in the year before in case you're not sure what a question is looking for. My most important reminder for all of you is please save. Please remember to hit save. Save every page before you click next to move on to the next section. Save even if you didn't enter any data or new information on the page. And do note that if you are entering numbers and they're going to calculate in a field farther down the page, those calculations may not run until you actually hit save for the page. Before you can submit your report, you do need to complete the suggested improvement section. You can see in the screenshot there that it is at the very bottom of the navigation list on the left-hand side of the report portal. It is the last section, but you must complete it. If you don't complete this section, the state will ask me in a few months to reach out to you and have you complete it then. So it's just easier if you complete it now when it's fresh in your mind. Given the unanticipated operational challenges impacting New York libraries, the State Library is extending the due date of annual reports to April 1st of 2021, but reports are due to STLS on Friday, March 5th. That gives us enough time to review your reports and reach back out to you with corrections that need to be made before they are final submitted to the state before that April 1st deadline. All of the STLS consultants on the call worked together to review your reports and reach back out with feedback after you submit them to us. And it's helpful for us to have time to do that review process. Please expect a minimal amount of renumbering due to questions added or reordered since the 2019 annual report. You'll see updates in the instructions for the report and rewording in some instructions for specific questions. So just look carefully at the instructions that come before each section. And if you tap on a question mark next to a question to understand what it's asking you for, you might notice that they're a little bit different this year. Responses to new questions requiring numerical data may be estimated or left blank for the first year. For example, there are some new COVID-19 questions that appear in section 8A. For those questions that do ask for a numerical response in section 8A, it's okay if you don't know the exact answer, you can estimate, and if you have no idea what the number might be, you can leave that blank this year. One question that I did receive in particular in question 8A is about question CV3, which asks, did the library add or increase access to electronic collection materials due to the coronavirus pandemic? All libraries can answer yes to this question because STLS and member library donations went toward increasing access to materials in our overdrive collection during the pandemic. In section 7, minimum public standards compliance is not, in 2020, is not required because of COVID, but please note you must still complete section 7, and in fact, you must complete it twice on this year's report, the first time for fiscal year 2020 as of December 31st, 2020, And the second time asks you to complete it for fiscal year 2021 as of January 1st, 2021. And the instructions do explain that. You'll see the sections are labeled separately, and we can answer questions about that if you have them. As I mentioned, Section 8A is new to the report. All of the questions in that section pertain to COVID-19, and most of them are yes, no. Section 9 asks about trustee education. You should complete one record for each person serving as a trustee as of December 31st, 2020. These trustees will not be exactly the same as the trustees listed in the section above, because trustees listed in Section 9 should be those trustees who are on your board as of February 1st, 2021. So trustee education applies to December 31st, 2020. Trustees on your board are February 1st, 2021. So many libraries offered live virtual programs and recordings of programs or story time during the pandemic. Libraries should report recordings of program content during COVID-19 in Section 8A, questions CV9 and CV10. Recorded only, so never offered live programs, should not be counted in Section 3. CV9 asks, did the library create and provide recordings of program content via the internet during the coronavirus pandemic? And CV10 asks you to report the total number of recordings of program content during COVID-19. It's an optional response. Responses, as I said before, to these new questions requiring numerical data can be estimated or left blank for the first year. If presented live and a recording was posted later, the live portion of that session counts in Section 3 as a program. Only the interactions with that live component count as attendance. Interactions with a program recording do not count as attendance, and attendance is not counted for a program that is recorded. Only the total number of recordings are counted in Section 8A. Similarly to recorded and live content, a lot of libraries offer take and makes or grab and goes during the pandemic. These should be counted as passive programs under question 3.22, which is one-on-one programming sessions. And then you can add a note to that particular question to explain why it might have increased so substantially from 2019 to 2020. Going forward, the Division of Library Development recommends that data for passive or self-directed programs be collected separately for reporting purposes beginning in 2021. This will help ensure data consistency across all states in the public library survey. So finally, after you've done all the hard work of completing the report, it might be helpful to know how to submit. So before you hit submit, please proofread your report, and you can do that just by making sure that there are no unanswered questions, you've satisfied all of the red edit checks, and you've reviewed any notes that you've entered to make sure they provide enough detail about why the change in numbers happened. So you need to do more in a note than just say this number is correct, but instead explain why that number is correct for 2020. You can submit the report at any time, but note that when you do submit, it will lock you out of the report. There's no problem. If you need to get back in, all you have to do is send me an email and I can unlock the report for you, so that's no problem. And just one final reminder, before you submit, question 12.42 will ask you when your board will meet to approve the report. It's okay if that date falls after the March 5th submission deadline. Please just enter the appropriate date for when your board is planning to meet to approve your report and submit the report with that date, still by the March 5th, 5 p.m. deadline to STLS.
Erica, hi,
Yeah.
it's Roxanne from Fillmore. I have a question.
Okay.
I think one of the questions on the report was asking attendance for virtual programs. Is that correct?
So there are questions, yes, Roxanne. So virtual programs, if they were offered live, will count in Section 3, depending on if they're early literacy or digital literacy or adult in the traditional sense with Section 3. But if they're recorded only, then they go in Section 8A.
So my story hour lady did almost everything live because it was easier for her.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she went every night, every day. So I didn't keep track. I mean, I don't really have time to go back for, 4 months worth of Facebook data.
Okay. Lori Brown, could you turn on your mic and jump in on that?
Let me get my microphone down. I know she went there every night. I watched many times. Easily that means you have numbers, I would, if you could randomly pick some days and count the peak performance on those particular days and then extrapolate it, make an estimate, Roxanne. And in the going forward, because we'll probably be offering remote things continually from now on, at least through next fall anyway, I would urge you to try and figure out how to make sure that you're noting that for next year's report.
So Chris at Angelica asks, I loaned some puzzles and a couple games without barcodes. Where can I count this?
So 3.1A, it says, regarding the number of library visits entered, is this an annual count or an annual estimate based on a typical week or weeks? So we have like those numbers. Is that what we put in, or should we estimate?
If you have an accurate count, you can include your accurate count. You don't have to estimate. I know that estimation might be difficult, in particular this year, because of the random nature of when we were open and not open.
And Erica, we have a half and half. Like we're estimated January through March, and then we started doing a physical count probably in September. So what would be the best answer in that case?
And you, I'm sure the second half of your stats are wildly different because you started using a door counter, right?
Right, yep.
Based on the information that I sent you when you asked about the door counter, please use your door counter stats to answer this question and apply your estimate to the entire year. Okay, so Katura has helpfully responded in the chat. So park passes and museum passes do go in 4.8 or 4.9. They are not print items, nor are they electronic materials, so that makes sense. And then, okay, Karen Smith posted in the chat, as of July, I have only one board member that was on previously. Do I record board members from January to June or July to December? So Karen, they want to know who was sitting on your board on February 1st, 2021.
2021.
If you go, and I know this moves against what you might expect because we're working on the fiscal year 2020 report, but if you open section 10, you can see that at the top of section 10, let me just share my screen that has this information on it. Here's the report. All right, so I'm in the report. I'm in section 10, part 1. At the very top of section 10, part 1, it asks to report information about trustee meetings, just the meetings, as of December 31st, 2020. Now, if we scroll down, we've entered meeting information. Now we're getting to the part where they ask us to list officers and board members as of February 1st, 2021. So that's why it's important to read the chunks of instructions that fall between parts of sections, because you'll see we're within the same section, but the top of this page is asking about December 31st, 2020. And now when we're listing board member information, it's as of February 1st, 2021. Roxanne, you do have the option to upload a spreadsheet. So the first part here that I have on my screen is asking about board president information. And then as you scroll to the part of section 10 where you're entering the rest of your board members information, you'll see you may enter the data or send Baker and Taylor a spreadsheet, and then they give you the spreadsheet form in the instructions right in that section. So if you did that last year and you liked that, you can do that again this year. I see Chris from Angelica posted in the chat, I have delivered books a few times to someone who is housebound. However, I do not advertise this. So how do I answer 3.11? Does the library provide services to persons who cannot visit the library?
Erica, I
Yes.
would say yes, although I'm not sure if the instructions specify that it has to be an advertised program. I don't think they do.
So it doesn't look like they do. So the instructions for that, it applies to the entire section. Accessibility, indicate whether the library provides services to persons who cannot visit the library and whether the library has assistive devices for the deaf and hearing impaired and blind and visually impaired. So it doesn't indicate that it has to be advertised. So I think, Chris, you could answer yes.
And while we're on that section, I'd just like to point out every year that STLS does offer the large print rotating collections. So you should all be able to answer yes to, do you have large print books?
Thanks, Katera. That's 3.13 for anybody who's hunting for that question. Does the library have large print books? You can answer yes.
We have a question. Last year, because of COVID, town vote on our budget. We're just saying. So are we supposed to put no for that one?
Judy, I'm so sorry, you cut out just a little. Could you repeat the beginning of your question, please?
Okay, I'm on question 147. Did the library receive funding from appropriation, which was approved by the public in the prior year? We didn't have the people vote last year, but we did receive funding from the year before that. So I guess that would still be yes.
Okay, so if you did not have a vote in 2020, is that what you said?
Right. We reneged on it. We were going to have one, then because Brian said we better not, we didn't do it.
Okay, so if you did not have a vote in 2020, you should respond in question 1.47. So you can say no to 1.46 because you did not have a vote in 2020, and then move on to question 1.47. And that will ask you about your most recent public vote.
Sure. So I'll start with PPP loans. So just working with Lori, what we've determined is PPP loans, as long as your entire loan was forgiven, it should be recorded under question 11.11, other federal aid. And that's because the funds were administered through the U.S. Small Business Administration. And even if you have not gotten your forgiveness letter on those loans yet, it's implied that those loans will be forgiven because of the spirit of the program. So I think it's perfectly fine to record it under 11.11, other federal aid. And the other question that Lori asked, and this is regards to construction aid, the guidance that we gave all libraries, and that's on the sheet that STLS sent out late last week, early this week, I can't remember, regarding finances, you only record construction aid under question 11.9, which are operating receipts, if you don't account for construction aid in a separate capital fund. So think of it this way: you have your pot of money in a money market or checking account that pays for all your operational costs like collections, salaries, technology, programs, etc. But when you do a major capital project, like an HVAC project or a new building or addition, your treasurer and your board might want to set up a completely separate money market fund to just make sure you're only accounting for that project completely separate from operational funds. So if you didn't mix money, then you would record it under capital aid. But if you did mix money for construction aid, you'd put it under the receipt of that construction aid would be 11.9. And I know there isn't really actually a lot of libraries that receive construction aid in 2020. I think there's 9 of you. So if you're on this call, just reach out to me after this call if you don't understand it, and we'll talk through it together. And then the last thing, or actually I'm going to share out a couple things just to be proactive here. On the let me see, on the revenue side for census aid, this really only applies to Allegheny County libraries because they're the only libraries that, at least I'm aware of, that receive direct aid from their county for census work. I'll give you, it would be under question 11.7. And for some of you that have received outreach mini grants in the past, you also record your outreach mini grants under question 11.7. So if you receive direct funds from the county to do census related work, it would be under question 11.7. And then I'm just going to highlight I'm going to highlight 3 expense questions for anybody that is working on the finance side. One, question 12.7, electronic materials expenditures. This is where you're going to record that digital library contribution invoice that you get from STLS in February. So back in February of 2020, just before the pandemic hit, all of you received an invoice from STLS via delivery that you paid for. Everybody paid up. That's the money that we all contribute towards the overdrive collection, so we can make sure patrons have access to ebooks. So that invoice that you paid to STLS gets recorded under question 12.7. The next question on the expense side folks might want to take note of is question 12.19, telecommunication. STLS administers almost 40 internet connection for almost 40 libraries. And so those libraries pay for their internet bill to STLS on a quarterly basis. So your next bill will be coming out just shortly after March. So those 4 bills that you get every year from STLS for internet connections, that gets recorded under question 12.19. And we want to make that clear just because last year there was some confusion around it. And then the last thing that you received on that sheet that went out last week or early this week is question 12.26, contracts with public libraries and or public library systems in New York State. So this is that other invoice that you received from STLS that's for ILS cost share. And again, February of 2020, all of our libraries received their STLS ILS cost share invoices via delivery, and all of you paid up. So however you recorded that on the annual statistical report, you'd record your ILS cost share contribution under question 12.26 or 12.26.
I have a question from Chris Gallman about a part-time summer employee. She worked over the summer for 15 hours a week for 12 weeks last summer. She also worked a few hours in the fall. So does that employee fall under 6.10 other staff? And I think, Chris, the answer is yes, because this question is asking you to count anybody who you didn't count in 6.2 to 6.9. And I don't think that person fits into any of those other categories. So 6.10 feels like the right place for that. Brian, do you, or Katura, I see you too.
I was just wondering if that counts if the library itself didn't pay her, if this was through the summer county summer employment program or not. I'm not sure.
That's a Brian question.
I paid her this year for the first time. She didn't qualify for the county since she had other jobs. But yeah, previously I had her through the county programs.
Yep, so a good question, good clarification question, Katura. And Chris, to answer your question, Eric is correct. So it would be recorded under other staff, 6.10.
All right, so Katura, just to clarify, you asked about did you ask about curbside interactions counting as visits?
Yes, that was my first question.
Okay, so the answer to that is no. Curbside interactions do not count as library visits in question 3.1. And this is because of the way the Division of Library Development defines a library as open. So to answer further, I'm going to respond to how the library should count open hours. So the federal definition for hours open is used, which is hours that the building is accessible to the public, regardless of staff access or other service provided. An outlet is considered physically closed when the public cannot access any library buildings or bookmobiles, regardless of staff access. A building can be physically closed, but still offer virtual Wi-Fi or curbside services outside of the building. But in that case, the library should not count the hours as open. They go on to clarify, are lobby services considered hours open? No, although the entry part of the building could be open for contactless service, patrons are not able to use the facility. In that way, lobby services are considered similar to curbside services, and the hours that a building is accessible for lobby services should not be included in public service hours. You don't have to include a note for question 1.49 indicating that COVID was an unusual circumstance for your library. However, the state has not indicated for which questions edit checks might be turned off. So it's certainly the case that your library visits numbers or your hours open will be significantly less for these questions than they were in 2019. However, the state has not shared which questions will have edit checks turned off, so I don't know if a note will be required for those individual questions or not. I would be inclined to err on the side of caution and avoid an edit check and mention it. If you feel that the difference is quite great or you want to remember that for years in the future, but I think the state is not looking for us to list COVID-19 as a response in every single note for every single question, so no need to do that.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So in the COVID section, number 4, did the library allow users to complete registration for cards online before the pandemic? We would say no, but in CV5 we could say yes, because during the COVID pandemic, the ILS team made that option available. Is that correct?
That's correct. Mandy, were there any, like I wondered if CCLD had online registration prior to the pandemic, they may be able to answer differently.
I know CCLD did, and I'm not sure if anybody else had that on their website. Maybe Corning did, I'm not positive. But I know that CCLD did before it was system-wide.
Okay. But yes, Katara, for most libraries, they would respond no to CV4 because they did not offer online registration. And then they could answer yes for CV5 because we opened up that online registration form across the system during the pandemic.
26, number of internet computers at this outlet used by general public. So if in normal times my library has 10 computers, but due to social distancing we had to block off 5 of those computers, should I use the number 10, which is what our normal availability is, or 5 if that's what we use for the majority of the year?
I would report what was used for the majority of the year, because if you had computers sitting in a closet during a non-pandemic year, you wouldn't count those for this question because they're not really able to be used by the public if they're sitting in a closet. So I would count only usable computers, and certainly if you took 5 away from your 10 total to maintain social distancing, then I would just count the 5 that were available this year or in 2020. Another reminder of something as you're working on your reports that carries over from year to year that you might want to check. So questions 1.23 and 9.10 or 9.10 both ask about your library website URL. If you think of it this year, have a look at that URL and make sure that it's actually the correct URL for your library website. Sometimes we do see that an old version of the URL has been carried over from year to year and it's no longer accurate. Something else while I'm on the STLS Annual Report webpage, you saw Mandy when she went over the registered borrowers data, come down to section 3, library programs, policies, and services, which is what that section is called on the report, and click this plus button to the right side. And then all of these tabs exist for that section, and we can see that registered borrowers is here. If we click on that, the information for registered borrowers shows up, and there's a link here. If I click on that, it opens the registered borrower spreadsheet. So that's how you navigate to the data provided for the report for that particular question. And if we go back to the page, if we wanted the library collection data, we'd click the plus button to open section 2, library collection, and click on holdings, and click
up there
here to open the spreadsheet.
Our square footage last year was 1,800, but then we added an addition. So it should be higher, but they won't let us change it. What are we supposed to do?
Yes, Judy, that's a great question. Katura and I were actually noticing that. Brian, I'm going to read the instructions right now, but does that require a variant? How do people update that when they've gone through a construction project?
I have no idea why that question's set. I think it's because normally it doesn't get changed from one year to the next. So unless there is a major capital project like they had in Richburg, then we have to reach out to DLD to have them open up that field so we can update it.
So we just leave it the way it is for this year, right now?
Yeah, Judy, I'm taking a note. I'll talk with Eric and I will figure it out on your behalf, and we'll try to see who we need to contact at DLD to get that field opened up so we can update it.
8.6 public service hours. So the minimum weekly total hours. So I have all of our hours calculated based on the hours that changed. So I don't know, like there were, part of a year that we were open 44 hours a week and then parts that we were only open 20 hours a week. So I'm not really sure.
Yes. So in the instructions for that particular question, they indicate that extensive hours closed to the public due to natural disaster or other events like COVID should be excluded from the minimum weekly total hours, even if staff was scheduled to work.
So it would be the average. So if you took because you've got like, you're breaking down your year almost like into 3 different sections. You've got pre-COVID, you've got stay-at-home orders, and then you've got New York State reopening. And so you take, if you're doing objective data analysis like Kelly's doing, so you're actually looking at the number of hours open. And I think we need to clarify, or we need to restate what the definition is of open hours from DLD, but you take that 52-week time period and you add up all the hours that you were actually open to the public, full-on services, and then you divide it by 52, and I think that's the number you come up with. So it's like an average.
Thanks, Kelly.
Erica, did we clarify though, like what is full for that specific question that Kelly's asking and the other ones that support it? Like, have we defined what actual hours are for opening?
So I did go over, and I'll repeat it now, the response from the state about what counts as open or not open. So how should a library count hours open? The federal definition for hours open should be used, which is hours that the building was accessible to the public, regardless of staff access or other services provided. An outlet is considered physically closed when the public cannot access library buildings, regardless of staff access. A building can be physically closed but still offer virtual Wi-Fi or curbside services, but in that case, those hours do not count as open. Lobby services are also not considered open hours.
So Erica, just for clarification then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but based on meetings I've sat in with DLD, they are not counting actual hours for the annual statistical report. So if you were only offering curbside service, those hours do not get counted. If you were only letting people,
if you throughout months of this time only offered curbside or lobby, your library was not open. People had to be able to come into the building and access everything they could access in a normal time for your library to be open.
So they should be able to come in, browse collections, sit down and use a public computer,
Use the bathroom.
search an OPAC. Yep. So pre-COVID level services.
Erica, can you point out where that written definition you just read is available?
Yeah, let me hit play. So on the screen now, I'm on the STLS Annual Report webpage, and I'm looking at the FAQs section. So I clicked the plus button to open that section, and I have an hours open tab. When I click on it, I can see how should the library count hours open and are lobby services considered hours open. There's also a section on library visits telling us that curbside interactions do not count as visits. There's also an FAQs sheet up here. If we click on that, it will open a Google Doc that repeats some of the same information about open hours, but then also has information on program counts, and then recordings of programs as well, which I read earlier and you can find here. Thanks, Katura.
Oh, and that reminds me of something we talked about at the last session, but not this one. So take and makes, and maybe Lori can correct me if I'm wrong, those are counted as one-on-one sessions? Was that what we determined?
That's correct. Take and makes and grab and goes can be counted as passive programs under question 3.22 one-on-one program sessions. I think during the last session we debated where story walks would fall, and those can also go under 3.22.
And another programming question, Erica, again, so if we had a virtual program or a recording that we put on Facebook Live, et cetera, we do not need to count the number of people who viewed it, correct? That's only for our internal use or to share with our community. It would not be needed by the state at this time.
If it's a recording, views don't matter for the report, but you would probably want to report interaction with recorded programming on the report you give to your community. So yes, collect it for internal use. But the only question that is numerical about recorded programs is how many recordings of program content during the pandemic did you provide?
I would also add that the question about recording, you're going to find that under the specific recording or specific question in 8A about COVID related questions. So it's not going to be in the generic programming questions in section 3. It's going to be down in section A. So don't get frustrated if you don't find it in programming.
All right, so we have a question in the chat from Carol. Where would we report Zoom meetings with community and groups? That is a great question, Carol. Let me take a moment.
Carol, do you mean like a book club that was held on Zoom, or a trustee meeting on Zoom? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get clear.
So if it was a book club that was over Zoom, that will get counted, and Lori Katera, feel free to chime in, but that will be counted under section 3 with your traditional programming numbers because that group met live over Zoom. And to meet the definition of a program, there has to be a live component. So that would count back over in section 3.
Correct. And if it happened to be part of the summer reading program, it could also be counted there. I'm not, if it isn't, just count it as, yeah, a program.
And I'm assuming when you look at questions in programming section 3, you'll also see that they're asking you about number of programs and attendance for specific targeted audiences. So if it's a book club for teens, then you'd enter that data in that targeted audience. If it's a book club for adults, you would enter it in that targeted audience. Another caveat is it's a book club you plan for adults. So you had 10 adults and you had 1 teenager. You always count your programming numbers in the targeted audience. And that follows through for everything. So if you have a program that you have designed and targeted for early literacy, but you have a 12-year-old at a 10, you just lump them all in there to that targeted audience. So that's important for you to know.
Hey, I have another question about the open hours.
Okay.
So I'm like looking back at it and I'm thinking, okay, so we were open for curbside. We didn't let people in, but we did let people in to use computers. Does that period of time?
Could they
should
only access computers, or could they access the entire building and browse collections?
Well, technically they were only supposed to use the computers, but if someone was in here, you know what I mean? I'm not going to say you can't check out that book that you're staring at. Like,
I would say because the rules that you were applying at that time indicated that the building was not fully open, then those hours don't count as open.
Okay, got it.
Thanks, Kelly.
Eric, I'm just going to add just some input for everybody. This is a tough year. 2020 was a tough year, and so is 2021. So, you know, the librarian in us wants to make sure that we're getting as much credit as possible for all the amazing work that we did for our communities. One thing I just want everybody to take just like a little bit of comfort in is we're going to be given a lot of leniency from the Division of Library Development on on issues such as number of hours open. So please don't overthink it any more than you have to. We're just trying to collect the data as best as we can so that, like, one, when we go back and look at the data, it's very apparent that there was an asterisk on 2020 and 2021 in terms of like the services that we provided and at what level. But DLD, we're just trying to do our best to interpret what DLD wants us to put forward not only to the state, but to the feds. So as a reminder, everything that you're putting into this report does go not only to the state library for review, but it also goes to the Institute for Museum and Library Services, which is our federal agency, I guess. So that's the national data that we always benchmark with. So as much as we always try to tell you guys just to, like, you know, don't stress the annual statistical report, you know, we're just going to do the best that we can, and that's always the approach that we're going to take. But at the same time, it is important data, and it's data that's used for a lot of reasons, particularly funding for libraries across not only our state, but across the nation. So, but going back to, you know, why I wanted to just provide some input on the issue is, just don't get upset if for some reason all services weren't provided this year. We knew that was the case a year ago in March when we went to stay-at-home orders. So it might be possible if your library only provided curbside service or lobby services as part of the New York State reopening, that technically the number of hours that you were open from March at the start of stay-at-home orders up until December 31st, 2020 do not count for your weekly or annual totals.
Hi, Bridget from the Avoca Library. We had our youth services person leave in September, and then I joined in December. Should I be putting any of that in 6.10 through 6.11?
Yeah, Erica might correct my interpretation. So I guess, like, for me, like when I complete this on behalf of the system, so we're trying to reflect what took place in 2020 in this report, but I also try to take into consideration what will most likely be the case moving forward, because current and complete data is most important. So, you know, I would just, wherever you currently stand right now, or how you think it's going to shake out in 2021 is really what you should report. So let's say if your current setup is you have a library manager, and you have, let me see if I can see this. Let me use specific titles. Hold on one second.
Brian, while you're looking at that, Section 6 indicates report figures as of the last day of the fiscal year reported in Part 1.
Yeah, so that's where I was going with, like, how things shaked out at the end of 2020. So I would just say whatever the stamp and time looked like on December 31st, 2020, that is what you should probably put in this report.